For months, the US and the EU have resisted calls to share their COVID-19 vaccine patents. But this week, Washington said it wants to help developing countries gain access to the intellectual property, and Brussels has indicated it's willing to follow suit. If approved, the measure could speed up the global rollout of the injections. But as Mobin Nasir reports, striking a deal and getting pharmaceutical companies to stick to it could take months.
After lining up for hours outside this inoculation center in Mumbai, these people have been asked to return at a later date with promises that they will receive a coronavirus vaccine. As infections and fatalities continue to mount, more and more Indians are trying to get the jabs. The Asian nation is home to the world's largest vaccine manufacturing facility, and yet only 9% of its 1.4 billion people have been inoculated against COVID-19. Supplies were running so short that the country halted all vaccine exports in March. For months now, India and 100 other developing nations have appealed for patent protections to be waived.
WHO joins countries around the world that are calling on vaccine manufacturers to remove obstacles that are preventing access to critical health products. We continue to call on companies to share know-how, intellectual property, and data with other qualified vaccine manufacturers, including in low and middle-income countries.
The US and the EU had initially resisted these calls and blocked negotiations over a temporary patent waiver at the World Trade Organization. But now, Washington has had a change of heart.
Mr. President, are you going to back a waiver of the US at the WTO? Are you going to back that? Is the US government
Yes,
going to back
I'm
that?
talking about that later today, yes.
Brussels says it may also be willing to share the technology needed to produce vaccines.
The European Union is also ready to discuss any proposal that address the crisis in an effective and pragmatic manner. And that's why we are ready to discuss how the US proposal for waiver on intellectual property protection for COVID vaccines could help achieve that objective.
Public health experts and humanitarian agencies have welcomed the announcement, saying it's a boost for vaccine equality and will narrow the gap between rich and poor nations' access to life-saving jabs. But pharmaceutical companies disagree. They say waiving the patents is not a practical solution and will only lead to disruption in the industry, sowing confusion among public and private partners, further weakening already strained supply chains and increasing the number of counterfeit vaccines. Not all EU leaders are on board, though. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says the suspension of license protections stifles innovation and could complicate production lines. Given this opposition, pushing approvals through the WTO will be cumbersome. Even if consensus is reached, it may be months before developing economies can begin producing their own supplies. So for billions of people in some of the world's worst-hit regions, the wait for a vaccine is far from over. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Dr. McDonagh is an intellectual property analyst and associate professor at the London School of Economics Law Department. I began by asking him if the drug company's argument that patent waivers will not improve the rollout of vaccines holds weight.
On the first issue of will this make a difference? Well, there are companies out there in the developing world, in SEPTA in Bangladesh, or in the developed world. In Israel, you have Teva, in Canada, you have BioLice. Companies that want to and have offered to manufacture these vaccines and have been rebuffed or have been unable to get a license. So there is manufacturing capacity out there that already exists that can be used. But there's another important point as well, which is that we simply do not have enough capacity in the world right now to vaccinate the whole global public. If there are more than 7 billion people in the world, most vaccines need 2 doses, so we need around 14 billion a year. We're nowhere near the capacity to produce that, which means we need to build more capacity. And the argument behind the waiver is that we should build that capacity and help to build it in developing countries. Because we've seen right now in India, which is one of the biggest vaccine manufacturers, there's no export happening of vaccines from India right now because of the national crisis there. And so neighboring countries, countries that were relying on exports, now are left in the lurch. So, we need enough capacity in the developing world to deal with the developing world's needs. The idea of the voluntary supply via COVAX, it simply is insufficient to the needs. On the point of innovation and the incentives for innovation, there's no doubt that R&D in the pharmaceutical industry is incredibly expensive. And it does require, a cost-benefit analysis. It does require a reward system in place, and that's why we have the patent system. But we need to emphasize that this is an exceptional situation. And as I said, the R&D in this particular field of COVID-19 vaccines has largely been de-risked already because so much public funding has gone into it already. The Oxford vaccine was developed at a public institution. We know the funding was about 97% from public money from the UK, from the US, from the EU. The Moderna vaccine has also benefited hugely from public funding. So, the incentive to create these vaccines has very much come from public funding and from state government directions. So I don't particularly buy the argument that this limited waiver, which only applies to COVID vaccines, will have the negative impact that the pharmaceutical companies say that it will.